What's the link between triathletes, Goldilocks, and the ketogenic diet? Today, we're going through what is a very dividing topic in the triathlon world. It's about a diet which some suggest is incredible for endurance performance, whilst others have concerns about how healthy or sustainable it is, and that it might actually worsen performance. I'm going to run through some of the evidence on sporting performance and health, and why this diet concerns me so much. And if you're new here, then hey, my name's James. I'm a registered sports nutritionist, and I work with amateur and professional endurance athletes. I help them to train and race better, improve their recovery, and do all of this in a healthy fashion. This topic is particularly important for me because of my interest in health and performance. If there's a nutrition strategy that I can leverage to improve performance whilst keeping an athlete healthy, then I'm going to use it. Now, most of you will be familiar with the story of Goldilocks and the Three Bears. Goldilocks stumbles upon a cottage in a forest, and she finds 3 bowls of porridge. She tries the first one, and it's too hot. She tries the second, and it's too cold. She tries the third, and it's just right. The same could be said for triathletes and their diet. They dabble in different ones to find what suits them. And some triathletes get drawn to the ketogenic diet, perhaps to improve performance, maybe for weight management, or because they think it's a healthier diet. But is the ketogenic diet too extreme, and does it really come with some of the benefits that people suggest? Well, there are many athletes and academics who advocate it, and there's examples of incredible athletes who follow low-carb approaches. People like Chelsea Sodaro, Dan Plews, Zach Bitter, and prominent authority figures like Professor Tim Noakes. They all have links to low-carb approaches. So what is it, and what makes it so special? A ketogenic diet is a diet where someone follows a pattern where they consume high-fat, moderate protein, and low carbohydrate foods. Now, to be clear, this is not the same as periodized carbohydrates, which we're going to cover later on. By consuming a low amount of carbohydrates, the aim is to put your body into a state of ketosis. In a nutshell, this means your body starts producing ketones to make up for the lack of dietary carbohydrates. Normally, your body uses a mix of carbohydrates and fats for energy, but during ketosis, your body shifts its main fuel source to fat. This results in ketones being produced, so essentially it's your body becoming adapted to burning fat when carbohydrates are scarce. From an endurance sports point of view, the aim is that you unlock the potential to essentially unlimited energy, where you upregulate or increase your ability to burn fat for energy, and you decrease your reliance on carbohydrates. So people who get positive benefits from following a ketogenic diet report being able to run or cycle for hours. So that might mean you have more stable energy levels during training or during a race. You reduce the need for more frequent fueling and can reduce the risk of gastrointestinal upset. And you do better over long distance events because you have such great access to your fat stores. But there are also potentially health benefits to a ketogenic diet. You're consuming less carbohydrates, which means the glucose load or burden on your body is less. You have to produce less insulin to deal with all of those carbohydrates. So all of that really sounds pretty awesome, but what does the evidence say? Now, there are definitely some studies within a sporting context that report benefits of a ketogenic diet. As you become more fat adapted, you're able to work at a higher percentage of your VO2 max. One study in 2023 found that those who are fat adapted could exercise at 85% of their VO2 max, which was the highest they've ever seen in research. Studies consistently show that fat-adapted athletes can burn more fat compared to those on a carbohydrate-rich diet. The problem is, though, that in race-specific scenarios, there isn't really any evidence that shows that they are equal or better to carbohydrate-rich diets. Now, there are plenty of anecdotal reports or case studies of athletes who have done extremely well on low-carb or ketogenic diets. But when you stack that against the evidence for carbohydrate-rich diets, it becomes really difficult to see it as a viable strategy. Some of the best research we have on low-carb versus high-carb diets in elite athletes seems to suggest that low-carb diets cause worsening performance. We also know categorically that high intensity exercise suffers with low carb diets. This is consistently shown in the research, and the mechanism is undisputable. Fat needs oxygen in order to be metabolized, whereas glucose or carbohydrates doesn't. This means that someone performing high intensity exercise is always going to struggle if they're following a low carbohydrate or ketogenic diet. There are also some studies which worry me when it comes from a health point of view. 2 studies investigating short-term low carbohydrate diets suggest there may be a risk to your bone health, as well as your immune function and your ability to absorb iron. It's also clear from the research that ketogenic diets are hard to follow. People struggle to maintain them for a long period of time, and they also struggle to consume sufficient calories while they follow them. This definitely matches what I found from working with amateur and professional athletes, in that those who follow the ketogenic low-carb diets really struggle to eat enough food, especially if they have high training volumes. This then increases the risk of things like RED-S, or relative energy deficiency in sport, which can lead to a whole myriad of health problems. And finally, I worry about the long-term health consequences of a ketogenic diet. We don't have loads of research on what's going to happen over the long term when someone follows a high-fat, low-carbohydrate diet. Typically, we see that when someone follows these high-fat diets, which are often high in saturated fat, there's an increase in cholesterol, which can increase your risk of cardiovascular disease, so heart attacks and strokes. But we do have research for things like the Mediterranean diet, which offers a balanced approach to food, which includes carbohydrates. Now, at some point, some of you might be thinking, but James, you've forgotten some other potential benefits of the ketogenic diet. What about your increased ability to burn fat, which should be better for your metabolic health? This is something which I've seen quite a lot on Twitter, and people really get into it. Now, on the face of things, this is awesome, and I'm all for this. But the problem is, again, we don't have much research that supports it, but we do have research that essentially supports a carbohydrate-rich diet. There's a fantastic study that looks at VO2 max and its relation to all-cause mortality. Essentially, the higher your VO2 max is, the lower your risk of death. Now, we know that people can achieve very, very, very high VO2 max numbers while following a carbohydrate-rich diet. And they might be extremely good at processing and burning sugar during exercise, but actually not that good at being able to burn fat. And we know that that high VO2 max relates to that low risk of death. But conversely, there's not really any metric that we currently have that does the same for fat metabolism. I would love this to be something which comes out in the research over the coming years, and some way we can test this theory more. But at the moment, this isn't really a potential benefit of the ketogenic diet. The other thing which people suggest as a benefit to the ketogenic diet is that it reduces your need to produce insulin, because you don't have all of these carbs coming in which raise your blood glucose and mean your body has to produce insulin to deal with them, so you have a lower glucose load. You're not working your pancreas as hard. Again, the problem is that research doesn't really demonstrate that this is an issue. It's absolutely normal for your blood glucose to rise when you consume carbohydrates, and for your body to release insulin to counter this. That is a normal physiological mechanism, and we want that. So as a bit of a side tangent, you might be seeing a lot of advertising at the moment for CGMs and how people are trying to keep their glucose readings flat and optimize their food in order to do this. Unfortunately, this just seems to be a bit of a trend and a fad, and there's just no real research to suggest that this is necessary or healthy. Now, I mentioned earlier about periodized carbohydrates, and it's worth talking about this. If you follow a periodized approach to your carbohydrates, it means you're tailoring how many carbohydrates you're consuming in a meal based on what exercise you're doing, how long you're exercising for, and the intensity. Now, this probably is the best approach to follow with your carbohydrates. If you know that you're not going to be exercising quite as much, or you're doing lower intensity exercise, you can reduce the amount of carbohydrates that you consume. Realistically, carbohydrates as a macronutrient simply provide energy. Yes, they might also contain micronutrients, so vitamins and minerals, but that's not really its core function. So if you look at it like that, then it makes perfect sense to reduce the amount of carbohydrates you eat. So for example, this might mean having smaller portions of rice or pasta, or eating less bread and instead opting for more protein and healthy sources of fat. So after all of this, we've kind of got to bring it back and have a bit of a summary. My take on this is that whilst there might be some benefits to a ketogenic diet, the risks far outweigh them. There's not enough evidence out there that suggests that it's superior for performance or for health compared to a carbohydrate-rich diet and a carbohydrate diet that supports your training. Conversely, there is evidence that suggests that a ketogenic is harmful for performance and potentially for your health. Now, to be clear, I'm not including someone who has got a medical reason to follow a ketogenic diet. I'm talking about the average person who wants to optimize their performance but also look after their health. Overall, I wouldn't suggest that you follow a ketogenic diet unless you've been directed specifically by a registered sports nutritionist, dietitian, or doctor or physician. Now, I mentioned that carbohydrates are linked to improved sporting performance, and I've put a couple of videos up on the screen for you now to watch where I explore this in more detail.